In the early morning hours on September 29, 2012, Shauna TFA would have gotten off work from being a cocktail waitress at a local casino. She went home.
She drives home exhausted, unaware that someone is already inside her house, waiting in the dark.
Parked her car in the garage, entered her house. A killer snuck up behind her and beat her to death with a hammer inside her own living room.
Hours later, a frantic 911 call comes in. A firefighter says his wife is dead, beaten beyond recognition, lying in a pool of blood on her own living room floor.
I hit this woman with a hammer over and over and over and over until the hammer broke.
911 emergency.
I think I need to report a break-in and a murder. My wife is on the floor, bloody, stiff, not moving.
When he stopped by his wife's house with their 8-year-old daughter, he noticed that the garage door was open, an unusual and suspicious sign that prompted him to go inside and check. As he stepped into the house, he discovered his wife, Shauna, lying motionless on the floor. She had been dead for quite some time. At first, it looks like a random break-in, a violent stranger, a tragic accident. But nothing about this case is random. Because the killer was not a stranger, the murder was not impulsive, and the person who wanted her dead may have been the one she trusted most. This was not a crime of passion, it was a plan.
When's the last time you saw her? Right, you're good. Take a deep breath.
I'm a fireman. I was at work yesterday, so I saw her about 36 hours ago, I guess.
In just 36 short hours, the lives of George TFA and his daughter were changed forever. Shauna, the woman he was separated from, but still legally married to, was dead, and the respected firefighter now faced an unimaginable tragedy. But the story holds a shocking twist: theft, surveillance cameras, and an accusation that would rock everyone involved. Let's take a deeper look into the dark and tragic murder of Shauna TFA. It was the early morning of September 29, 2012. Shauna TFA, a cocktail waitress, was captured on CCTV footage as she clocked out of her shift at Palms Casino at 3:01 a.m. That was the last time she finished a shift, and the last time she was ever seen alive. She drove roughly 30 minutes home. Shauna entered her house through the garage and moved through the darkness without turning on the lights, eager to go straight to bed after a long, exhausting night on her feet. She walked down the hallway toward the staircase, and that was when everything turned horrific. Someone was lurking in the shadows of the hallway. The person was holding a hammer. The attacker lunged at Shauna.
Her hands were up at some point to protect her head and her face. Her fingers were broken, and she was savagely beaten with this metal head of that hammer until she was dead.
That was the scene George TFA would later walk into. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the mother of his child had been brutally murdered in her own living room. But why? And who killed her? To understand the crime, we need to go back and learn who Shauna was. Shauna's story began in Salt Lake City, Utah. Born in March of 1966, she grew up in a Mormon household with one sister and 5 brothers. The family lived in Utah until she was 12 years old, then moved to Pennsylvania, and later to Virginia, where Shauna attended South Lakes High School. There, she was well-liked, feminine, outgoing, and a member of the cheerleading squad. She graduated in 1984, with what seemed like a bright future ahead on the East Coast. But perhaps having grown up in the West, she missed the desert climate. In 1994, at the age of 28, Shauna decided to move back west to Las Vegas, Nevada. The bright lights of the so-called Sin City were a stark contrast to her Mormon upbringing. She initially moved to be closer to her sister, Paula, but Las Vegas was hardly known for quiet family life. At first, Shauna worked in high-end retail stores like Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, but she was soon drawn to the energetic world of resorts and casinos, where even service jobs could be extremely lucrative. A few years later, she became a cocktail waitress at the Fiesta Casino, and later landed a similar position at Palms Hotel and Casino when it opened in 2001. Shauna loved her job. She found it glamorous and exciting, and her coworkers felt like family. One colleague later said, "I never once saw Shauna sad. She was always smiling, always upbeat, and she genuinely loved being a cocktail server." Shauna earned close to $100,000 a year from wages and tips, often paid in casino chips with cash value. Some nights, she could make $500, which would be worth nearly $850 when adjusted to 2024 values. For Shauna, Las Vegas wasn't just a party city, it was a city of opportunity. She liked making money, and she liked spending it. But that part comes later. It was at the Palms in 2002 that Shauna met George TFA, the man who would later become her husband. George was born in September of 1972, making him 6 years younger than Shauna. He grew up on a chicken farm, lost his father early, and was raised with a strong work ethic. That discipline showed in his education. He graduated as valedictorian of his high school class, and was accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers, building schools and water systems in developing countries. After leaving the military, George found office engineering work unfulfilling and decided to become a firefighter in Las Vegas. George was considered the classic all-American man, charming, friendly, family-oriented. He regularly sent money home to support his mother, who cared for his disabled sister. He was also good-looking, even appearing in a firefighter pin-up calendar. It was no surprise that Shauna was drawn to him, and the two quickly fell in love. A year after meeting, their daughter was born. 3 years later, they married in Hawaii during a beautiful beach ceremony on March 16, 2006, just 3 days after Shauna's 40th birthday. The photographs showed a happy couple, no hint of the tragedy that lay ahead. But by 2008, things began to change, not just for George and Shauna, but for millions of Americans. That year marked the Great Recession. Unemployment soared, the housing bubble burst, and Las Vegas, a city dependent on tourism and casinos, was hit especially hard, and foreclosures swept through neighborhoods. The TFA family was not spared. George lost money in the real estate market, and the couple was forced to cut back, placing immense strain on their marriage. George became increasingly jealous and controlling.
He would tell her that she dressed like a slut when she would get dressed for work in front of Maddie, which of course would tear Shauna apart, for her little girl to hear these things.
Shauna could not tolerate that. George also complained about her spending habits, which only worsened tensions. Shauna worked hard for her income and believed she had the right to use it as she pleased. She was also deeply uncomfortable with a homeless man George hired to do odd jobs around the house. While George saw it as an act of kindness, Shauna found the man frightening and unsafe. The marriage continued to deteriorate. After 10 years together and 6 years of marriage, Shauna decided she had had enough. In April of 2012, she moved out of the family home. At the time, their daughter was 8 years old, and the two parents began sharing custody, but it was anything but easy. Shauna continued working long overnight shifts as a cocktail waitress, while George worked as both an EMT and a firefighter, with shifts that were just as long and demanding. As a result, their daughter spent a great deal of time with her paternal grandmother, George's mother, who lived nearby. Perhaps out of concern for her daughter, Shauna was not yet ready to fully let go of the marriage. Or perhaps it was because she was an idealist, a woman who had achieved her dream of working under the bright lights of Las Vegas and was unwilling to give up her handsome, charismatic husband or the beautiful family life she once had. Shauna was always optimistic. She persuaded George that they should attend marriage counseling. Throughout the summer, they made an effort to repair their relationship. But by early September, Shauna's life took a darker turn. Her home was broken into. Someone had entered her house, used her bathroom, and stolen her wedding ring along with a bikini bottom. The intruder also left something behind: a small-sized pair of boxer shorts.
This burglary, did it shake her up?
It did.
But I just don't think that in her mind she ever thought that any harm would come to her.
In the early morning hours of September 29th, just 3 weeks later, Shauna finished her shift at 3 o'clock in the morning. She was exhausted and emotionally drained from her failing marriage, the challenges of co-parenting an 8-year-old child, and the recent home invasion. She no longer had the energy to stay alert, and she could never have imagined that someone was already waiting for her in the darkness, holding a weapon, lying in wait for her return. The wound to the side of Shauna's head was so severe that paramedics who responded after George's desperate 911 call initially believed she had been shot. This was clearly a deliberate and brutal act, carried out with a single intention: to kill. Police immediately suspected George. In cases involving marital separation, the husband is often the primary suspect. But George had an alibi exactly as he told the 911 dispatcher, and later explained to officers at the scene.
She was lying on the floor. Okay. And she was covered in blood. I just want to die.
What shift did you work yesterday?
A 24-hour shift.
George had been on duty overnight at the fire station. Their daughter had spent the night at her grandmother's house. That morning, George picked her up and stopped by Shauna's home because the child wanted to retrieve a few belongings. Their discovery of the horrific scene appeared to be entirely random. With a solid alibi, George could not be the killer. The case quickly stalled. Aside from George, there were no other obvious suspects. Interviews with Shauna's co-workers painted a consistent picture. She was kind, cheerful, hardworking.
She was a sweet person, beautiful. All the customers loved Shauna so much.
Police began to consider the possibility that a predator was stalking the area. Women working in casinos, in particular, became fearful, worried that they might be the next targets. The earlier break-in at Shauna's home now appeared to be a disturbing warning sign. Was it connected to the murder? Investigators did not yet know. But 2 days into the investigation, they received an unexpected break. A man named William Penix, known as Big Will, came forward with critical information. Will had lived in Las Vegas for many years and worked as a maintenance employee at an apartment complex. He lived an honest life and tried to help others do the same, including a man he knew only by the nickname Greyhound. Greyhound lived in a tent near the foothills, a life completely opposite to the glamorous image of Las Vegas portrayed in movies. He was a former inmate, and Will had been trying to help him get back on his feet. Then one day in September, Greyhound approached Will and confessed.
He said, I got something to tell you. And I said, well, what is it? He said, I just murdered a woman.
When he told you that he had killed this woman, what was the expression on his face?
He was happy. Happy like he just completed a mission to where he's going to get paid a lot of money. He's going to leave town and live a happy life like that.
Did he tell you how he killed this woman?
Yeah. He told me that he was laughing when he said it. He said, I hit this woman with a hammer over and over and over and over until the hammer broke.
Will immediately contacted the police. At first, investigators were skeptical. The lead seemed almost too convenient. Still, they decided to follow up. Greyhound was known to steal food from an Albertsons grocery store, so investigators, accompanied by Will, went there to determine when he had last been seen. Will also knew that Greyhound occasionally sold drugs at a nearby gas station. In the end, they didn't need witnesses at all. Will spotted him on the street. Police approached Greyhound. He was carrying drugs, which gave them legal grounds to take him into custody. Greyhound's real name was Null Stevens. During questioning, Stevens vehemently denied ever telling Will that he had killed a woman with a hammer. Without a confession, police needed physical evidence to connect Stevens to the crime. They searched his campsite, combing through miles of desert around Las Vegas on foot and by helicopter. Eventually, near the foothills about 8 miles from the Las Vegas Strip, they found Null's tent. And there, they found what they needed: a pair of pants, rolled up and hidden beneath a bush. The pants were soaked in blood. The garment was sent for DNA testing. When the results came back, the truth was undeniable. The blood belonged to Shauna. Null Stevens was directly linked to the murder. Police used this evidence during the next interrogation. They told him that someone had come forward identifying him as Shauna's killer, though, in reality, Will had never known who Shauna was. The tactic worked. Null confessed. He admitted that he had broken into Shauna's home, hid inside, waited for her return, and when she came home from her shift in the early morning hours of September 29th, he attacked her with a hammer. But one enormous question remained. Why? Why would a homeless former inmate know who Shauna was or have any reason to kill her? Police searched Null's cell phone for clues. What they found turned the entire case upside down. They discovered George TFA's phone number. When investigators asked Null who George was, he replied, "That's my friend the firefighter." He said that George would sometimes hire him to do odd jobs around the house. Suddenly, all the pieces began to fall into place. Null was the homeless man George had brought into their home. the very man Shauna had always felt uneasy and afraid around. The person who killed her was someone she knew. Worse still, she had sensed that he was dangerous. So how exactly was George involved? On the very day Shauna was murdered, her sister Paula already had suspicions. Paula and her husband called George after learning of Shauna's death, and they recorded the conversation.
Hello?
George?
Yep.
This is Paula. Can you tell me what's going on?
Shauna passed away.
And what did they do to her?
I don't know, just laying on the floor with blood.
At the time of the call, George was standing outside Shauna's house with a grief counselor. After a brief exchange, George handed the phone to the counselor, who continued speaking with Paula and her husband. But Paula did not need comfort. She needed to voice her suspicion.
No one else can hear what I'm saying, correct?
Correct.
I have my suspicions that her husband may be involved in this, based on, many conversations I've had with my sister. I highly suspect that he may be involved.
Paula's concerns were not taken seriously, primarily because George had an alibi that seemed nearly impossible to refute at the time of the murder. Blaming a homeless man with a criminal record like Noel Stevens was far easier than suspecting a respected citizen, a firefighter like George TFA. But then, the connection between the two men began to surface. Investigators discovered that George and Noel had spoken on the phone 87 times in the span of just 1 month. This was clearly not a casual acquaintance. They had first met when they lived on the same street. Before becoming homeless and moving into the desert, Noel had lived with his sister just a few houses away from George and Shauna. That was how they became acquainted. Noel began doing odd jobs for the TFA household, and that relationship continued even after he became homeless. Noel idolized George. George was charismatic, confident, and appeared successful despite the fact that he was struggling financially after the collapse of the housing market. So when George gave him $600, along with the promise of thousands more if he killed Shauna, Noel did not refuse. He agreed. Initially, Noel told police that they had discussed staging the death as an accident. Noel would strike Shauna on the head, place her in her car, and crash the vehicle into a wall. But a medical examiner would inevitably discover head trauma, raising suspicion. They also discussed suffocating her with a plastic bag, but Noel feared Shauna would fight back and scratch him, leaving behind his DNA. According to Noel, George even suggested killing Shauna at Palms Casino, and drew a diagram of where she usually parked her car. But when Noel climbed over the wall into the parking garage, he was overwhelmed by the casino's heavy security presence and fled. In the end, they agreed that Shauna's home was the ideal location for the murder, to a killing planned with cold calculation. George gave Noel a key to the house. Noel used that key to scout the home roughly 20 times, including the break-in 3 weeks before the murder, the mysterious burglary in which Shauna's jewelry and underwear were taken. That was not a random burglary, it was a rehearsal, a prelude to something far more deadly, arranged by her own husband. Investigators also uncovered surveillance footage showing George and Noel together at a Lowe's store, purchasing a hammer, knives, and gloves just weeks before Shauna was killed. Later, Noel led police to the location where he had buried the murder weapon. The attack had been so violent that the handle of the hammer snapped in half. The hammer still bore a barcode matching the Lowe's purchase. Taken together, these pieces formed an overwhelming and undeniable chain of evidence, showing that George was directly involved in the murder of his wife. 9 days after the killing, on October 8, 2012, investigators confronted George's family and presented all of the evidence. They were shocked and unable to believe it. After that meeting, George's sister called him likely to warn him that police were closing in. George took his daughter to his mother's house, then immediately drove away in his truck. He sped through city streets, merged onto Summerlin Parkway, accelerated to 90 miles per hour, and slammed directly into the median. There were no skid marks. Police believed it was a suicide attempt. George survived only because he was wearing a seatbelt. From his hospital bed, George TFA was formally charged with his wife's murder. At the police station, Noel Stevens was also charged. In 2013, Noel pleaded guilty and agreed to testify in exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty. However, to prove that George was the mastermind, Null needed to be a credible witness.
Where did you grow up?
Out of California.
When you get nervous, do you have sometimes a little trouble speaking?
I stutter.
Are you just doing work for him, or is there some
friends?
What kind of things have you done together?
We worked out, stuff like that.
He admitted that he had broken into Shauna's home earlier, intentionally leaving behind the boxer shorts, and that it was a rehearsal for the actual murder.
What happens when you come out that door and you're holding that hammer?
She tells me why I'm doing this.
She says, "Why are you doing this?"
Yes.
Who told you to kill Shauna?
George.
That testimony was the final nail in George TFA's fate. Although Null admitted to experiencing hallucinations and having an unstable past, the complexity of the crime made it impossible to believe he had fabricated the story on his own. Null also stated that leaving the garage door open was a pre-arranged signal to let George know the job was done when he arrived the next morning. That detail became even more chilling when it was revealed that George had brought his 8-year-old daughter to the scene that day. George did not testify in his own defense. The only witness who spoke on his behalf was his sister, who described him as kind and of good character. It was not enough.
In all the years that you've known George, have you ever known him to be a violent person?
Never, ever, ever.
I have no further questions.
On September 3, 2015, George TFA was convicted on all charges, including first-degree murder. In December of 2015, he was sentenced to life in prison. In 2017, George filed an appeal. He personally wrote a 100-page petition after his attorney withdrew from the case, likely due to the allegations contained in the appeal, which claimed ineffective assistance of counsel. George also argued that he had been influenced by medication prescribed for injuries sustained while working as a firefighter, and that he had been directed by God to kill Shauna in order to protect their daughter. The appeal was denied. The court concluded, the defendant planned the murder while continuing to work, care for his daughter, and maintain a cordial relationship with the victim in order to avoid suspicion surrounding her death. Given the patience, concealment, and persistence involved in the conspiracy, the defendant cannot demonstrate a reasonable probability of acquittal or a lesser sentence. According to police and prosecutors, the true motive was money. Investigators found evidence that George attempted to hide funds through his mother, and that the marital conflict stemmed from the economic downturn and disputes over Shauna's spending habits. That, they believe, is what led George to coldly hire Null Stevens to murder his wife. In 2023, the daughter of George and Shauna graduated from high school. She has lived with her grandmother ever since the tragedy of 2012. This is not just the story of a murder. It is a story of betrayal disguised as love. Shauna believed she was trying to save a family. She did not know that someone was quietly planning to destroy it. All the while, the mastermind kept going to work, kept caring for his daughter, kept playing the role of a devoted husband while his wife's death was being calculated step by step. There was no sudden rage, no moment of lost control, only cold patience, only greed, and a decision that could never be undone. In the end, justice was served. But what can never be restored is a mother who is gone, a childhood that was stolen, and a chilling truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is not a stranger in the dark, but the one you trust the most, standing right beside you. If this case unsettled you, you're not alone, because this wasn't the only crime hidden behind a perfect life. In the next video, we uncover another story where the truth was buried even deeper, and the warning signs were ignored until it was too late. Stay with us. The next case begins where trust ends.